Good morning. Thank you for coming. Acceptable interpretations, or interpretations, create the very facts that prove them. You may remember that last year I spoke about recognizing an artifact as a map. Part of being a map is having a meaning. So a key part of recognition of a map is our imposition of an interpretation, a meaning upon it. Recognition segues into interpretation, but for the artifact's status as a map to be maintained, that interpretation must be acceptable. If we find the interpretation to be untenable, we'll toss the artifact aside as a phony, that is to say, not a map. What then constitutes an acceptable interpretation? How do we know an acceptable interpretation when we encounter one? I maintain that interpretations create the very facts that prove them, and that interpretations will fight for their lives. And that is what I'm going to discuss today. The English Romantic painter John Constable rightly observed that we see nothing truly until we understand it. Similarly, the hero of C.S. Lewis's novel Out of the Silent Planet was initially bewildered when, finally arriving on Mars, he found he could make nothing of the shapes and colors before his eyes. To quote, he gazed about him, and the very intensity of his desire to take in the new world at a glance defeated itself. He saw nothing but colors, colors that refused to form themselves into things. Moreover, he knew nothing yet well enough to see it. You cannot see things till you know roughly what they are. His first impression was a bright, pale world, a watercolor world out of a child's paint box. A moment later, he recognized the flat belt of light blue as a sheet of water, or something like water, which came nearly to his feet. They were on the shore of a lake or a river. We see nothing truly till we understand it. You cannot see things until you know roughly what they are. Constable's and Lewis's characters' remarks point to that very fact that interpretations create the very facts that prove them. Interpretation is a circular process, one that pulls itself up by its own bootstraps. This circularity is not the logical fallacy of circular reasoning, but is instead a commonly encountered phenomenon. A computer, in powering up, uses instructions in its operating system to load that OS into memory and begin using the system to interpret input. In other words, the operating system pulls itself up by its own bootstraps. This is why we speak of a computer booting up. Its operating system is bootstrapped into action. In recent years, I've been speaking about how we recognize maps and the importance of the map-not-map inflection. These explanations have of necessity been strictly abstract. No one would be able to derive the existence of any particular map from the abstract mechanisms I've discussed, but it is those mechanisms that underpin the existence of every map. In Pittsburgh, I drew a distinction between theoretical and connoisseurist approaches to mapping, to dividing the broad and abstract from the particular and contingent, dividing being a map from being a good map, dividing ontology from epistemology. Today, I'm looking at how those differences are bridged. By accepting an artifact as a map, we situate it against a horizon of other maps, maps that by definition have interpretations. It is our juxtaposition of this map with the map horizon that points us to what I'm calling an acceptable interpretation. Acceptable being a condition that will vary for every interpretive community, for every individual, for every map type, and potentially for every map. I'm defining an acceptable interpretation as one that we find persuasive of its soundness to ourselves, and that is, in some manner, at least potentially persuasive to our fellows. I'm not saying that the interpretation is right. Truth does not come into the matter, except as a potential judgment somewhere down the road. The question of, do I trust this map, has not yet arisen. The question is still, am I reading meaning into this map in a reasonable manner? Trust is engendered by confidence in that reading. I look at an artifact and decide it's a map. I expect a map to forward a proposition, to tell me, to persuade me of something. I expect it to employ certain combinations of graphic features in order to do that, and that those features are in some manner indicative of a believable argument. Before I can believe the map, I have to believe my reading of it as a map. Only then can I evaluate the argument I believe I've discovered and judge that argument on the evidence my reading has presented me. That's not the maps presented to me, but my reading has presented. To start by asking if I believe a map or how and why it is anyone believes any map is to get doubly lost. Your question is too late and too narrow. By the time you are judging a map's veracity, you've already made a whole string of decisions that have created the meanings that you're using as evidence. As I said before, recognizing an artifact as a map transfigures that artifact into an embodiment of meaning. It instantly acquires a context and the implication that a purpose must exist for it. It also acquires an assumption that the artifact was meant to be a map and that the artifact had a maker. It is further assumed that the posited maker had some reason for making a map, a reason that always includes, first and foremost, an intention to persuade someone, maybe even you, about some purported fact, and that to do so, this maker has made some assumptions about who it is that is to be persuaded. It is further assumed that the maker's assumptions about the readers will include assumptions about what those readers will expect to see on or in a map artifact, including about the sets of norms and conventions the readers will be expecting. In a very real sense, both sides of this transaction are makers. The artifact maker is constructing an artifact that will have a good chance of, first, being recognized as a map, and then of being interpreted in some manner, lending itself to an understanding that at least approximates the one that the artifact maker desires. The role of the reader, on the other hand, is to actually make a conceptual map in their mind out of the artifact by bringing their own map experience, literacy, and skills to first recognize and then to interpret the artifact, to transfigure the artifact into a map, and to come to a reading. Both makers in this activity rely on what they know about how maps work. That is to say, what they know about that thing that I, back in 2017 in Montreal, called the map-making game. This game, like everything in human society, is made up of learned sequences that are characterized by roles, rules, goals, rituals, language, and value. And the particulars of those elements vary from by cultural community, but all map-reading communities must have all of the elements in some form. Knowing what a map is the same thing as knowing at least some variant of the map game. Both an experienced and sophisticated map artifact maker and an experienced and sophisticated map artifact reader must each perforce be familiar with at least one and possibly many variations on the game. Although each of their games might not ultimately be the same ones. If the maker is mistaken in adopting assumptions about the experiences and expectations of their potential reader, that potential reader may not become a reader. They may not recognize the artifact as a map. Or they may not become the reader that the artifact maker wants or expects, which is to say that their interpretation might very well be quite different from that the maker hoped to invoke. From the maker's point of view, the technical name for this happenstance is failure. This is not to say, however, that the reader will necessarily see it as a failure. The reader may be perfectly happy with what they think they read in or into your map. The point is that any map is a long-distance transaction, one where each party is only able to make what they hope are educated guesses about what the other party is trying to say or will understand. After making the map maker's role is ended. It's done. The reader then need only find an interpretation, a reading, acceptable to themselves. Where will they find that reading? In 1968, the Polish writer Stanislaw Lem published his 12th novel, His Master's Voice. It is a story about an effort by scientists to decode, translate, and understand an extraterrestrial neutrino signal originating from the direction of the constellation Canis Minor, or Little Dog. The novel hinges on the question of what constitutes a message. For example, how can a message be read if the reader knows nothing about the senders? For example, where in a signal does the information lie? The information in an FM radio transmission lies in the modulation of the signal frequency, hence FM, and that of AM lies in the modulation of its amplitude. By the end of Lem's novel, all theories about the neutrino transmission turn out to be unverifiable. No one is any more sure than they were at the beginning about whether the signal was a message from intelligent beings that humanity failed to decipher, or just a poorly understood natural phenomenon. In our case, we have a leg up on Lem's HMV scientists. We have access to the diverse heritage of human map making, something we today call cartography. That we can reach any interpretation of any map is precisely because we can recognize and leverage the features that I have called mapicity. Those features that identify for us where in the artifact we can look for and discover map information. And it is our discovery of those features that gives us confidence in the validity of our reading. It is not a guarantee of validity, but it serves as an implied warranty for our reading. Thus, despite what some people have insisted I try to do, no one can restrict or ring-fence map interpretation. However, each of us will only accept certain range of interpretations as reasonable and valid. We can, if we select any fantastical interpretation if it suits us. In practice, of course, we rely on norms and conventions shared by our circle of fellows, and the diversity of our circle indicates our sophistication. We adhere to normative readings because, and only because, it is often in our interest to do so. Conversely, if we choose to apply other types of readings, non-normative readings, it is also because, and only because, it is in our interest. It is, for example, seldom in one's interest to interpret a navigational chart in a non-normative manner. I have been in the past, and you can believe it or not, the licensed captain of a commercial passenger-carrying vessel. For me, on the bridge of my ship, applying non-normative interpretations to a navigational chart could easily have led to loss of life, loss of the vessel, and legal liability. Thus, non-normative interpretations were not in my interest. Thank you very much. Come hell or high water, I am going to pass a South Cardinal buoy on the named side. So the things that go into arriving at an acceptable interpretation are your training in literacy, what you know about maps, what you know about what maps tell you and how it is that maps go about telling you. 2, your assumptions about what the artifact maker is trying to make you believe and about how you think they would go about persuading you. And 3, the value an orthodox, counter, or improvisational reading is going to have for you. In any event, this operation, like your initial decision that an artifact was a map, is very much in your hands. On the one hand, no one can force you into a reading you won't accept. But on the other hand, you are familiar with at least some of the tactics and stratagems likely to be employed by map makers to appeal to you. It is up to you to make the artifact you have transfigured into a map serve your needs and ends. Of course, you can always choose a subversive or a counter reading, playing assumptions, codes, and intentions off one another. In any and all cases, however, the acceptability of any reading comes down to your own judgment of your own interpretation. You come to that interpretation because you know roughly what you are looking at, and it was your interpretation that created the very facts that convinced you you were right. The end.
Right.